"Who do you think you are sitting here? A woman who doesn't know her place?" Officer Calvin Rourke growled, right in the middle of the Charleston courtroom, where Amara Jefferson, a black congresswoman and former civil rights attorney, was silently observing a juvenile trial. What he didn't know was that the slap he struck across Amara's cheek would trigger an earthquake, not just in her body, but throughout a justice system rotting from the inside out. Within 4 minutes, without a single shout, without striking back, Amara reversed the entire balance of power with nothing more than silence, a look, and an unshakable belief in justice. This isn't just the story of a woman insulted. It's the story of everyone who has ever been taught to stay silent to survive. And you? What would you do? When injustice stares you in the face, do you turn away or stand your ground? Tell me about your feelings about the city you live in. I want to know how far this story can go. Amara Jefferson didn't come to draw attention. She wore a light gray blazer, black slacks, and a pair of worn-out flats. No security detail followed her. No nameplate, no microphone pointed in her direction. Here's a black woman walking slowly through the Charleston County Courthouse lobby, holding a thin file and an unhurried gaze. The case that day wasn't on her official schedule. She wasn't here because of her district or the media. She had only heard from a former colleague that a 15-year-old boy was being unlawfully detained and brought in for a preliminary hearing, one that no one outside the system even knew about. A hearing with no cameras, no public notice, and that chilled her to the bone. She didn't come as a congresswoman. She came as someone who lost a younger brother to a police beating and never got an apology, as someone who knew silence could rob justice faster than violence. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick with an unnameable tension. Wooden benches creaked as people adjusted their posture. The stale scent of old paper and cold coffee hovered, as if the place had never been properly aired. A woman in the back row whispered to the person next to her, then fell silent the moment she saw Amara walk in. She sat in the third row, far from the bench. From there she could see Micah Bell, the teenager on trial, through a small window in the adjacent room. He wore an oversized hoodie. His hands were loosely cuffed. His legs swung gently. No lawyer at his side, no one with him, just a kid, swallowed by case files and centuries of legal precedent. Across the room, a man in a police uniform stood near the prosecutor's table. Calvin Rourke. Amara didn't recognize him immediately. All she saw was a tall figure, arrogant eyes, and hands constantly adjusting his belt or epaulets. But when their eyes met, just for a second, she knew something was wrong. It wasn't the usual tension. It was the look of a man who knew she was a threat, even though she hadn't said a word. A look that said, "Don't walk in here." Amara didn't look away. She'd seen hundreds of stares like that in her career. She knew to straighten her back, take a breath, and say nothing, just so he'd feel that her calmness was the real threat. No one called her name. No one waved her up to speak, but her presence alone shifted the room's energy. Not loud, but the kind of silence that makes people afraid to breathe. And then that silence was shattered, not by words, but by action. The courtroom door creaked open. Micah Bell was led in, dark eyes darting, his cheek bruised with fading purple. Amara saw his hand twitch, a reflex to the harsh lighting or the unfamiliar faces surrounding him. A stenographer tapped gently on the desk, but no one truly paid attention. At the prosecution table, Calvin Rourke stood motionless, but his fist clenched so tightly his knuckles bulged. His eyes kept flicking toward Amara. He couldn't hide his agitation, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because she dared to be in a place he considered his. He didn't want questions. He didn't want anyone peeking into the system he helped build, file by file, case by case. The elderly judge walked in, adjusted his glasses, and began slowly, "This is the preliminary hearing for the matter on the 12th involving the defendant, Micah Bell." Before the judge could finish his sentence, Calvin Rourke stepped down the aisle between the benches. He said nothing, didn't ask permission. No command was issued. He just walked, his eyes locked on Amara like a drawn blade. Slap, he raised his hand and struck her. It wasn't a slap meant to insult. It was a real hit. The sound of flesh on skin cracked like a whip in an old jailhouse, ripping through the silence that had blanketed the room. Amara didn't fall. She didn't raise a hand to her cheek. Her eyes stayed open, fixed on him as if the slap hadn't touched the one thing she still protected, her dignity. A second later, the room went dead quiet. The judge froze. The prosecutor clenched his file, lips pale from pressure. The clerk dropped her pen. Everyone was frozen. No one stepped in. No one shouted. No one, except Amara, dared to move, but she didn't need to speak. Her silence was the first counterstrike. She stood firm. No outrage. No cry for justice. Not in the way men like him expected. That slap wasn't meant just for her. It was for everyone who ever stayed silent while justice was crushed under uniform and power. And that slap, unexpectedly, was what cracked the system open. Rourke stepped back. His hand was still red, but he was the one trembling, because in her eyes there was no fear, only recognition. She saw him, not a model officer, but a symbol of rot wrapped in procedure. "Not yet," she said. 2 words, soft but echoing like a verdict. Not yet, but the time will come when he, in the system, will have to answer, not for one slap, but for the hundreds more no one has dared to speak about, in a room filled with power, rules, and familiar faces that had long learned to look away at just the right moment. Amara Jefferson did not flinch. After a slap that cracked through the air like a knock at the gates of hell, she remained standing, back straight, unmoving, eyes locked onto the face of the man who struck her. There was no scream, no tears, no demand for an arrest. That silence unsettled everyone in the room. People who had sat through hundreds of trials now held their breath. She didn't react according to the script they all knew too well. The crying, the outrage, the immediate call for justice. And because she didn't need to shout to shake the room. Her silence became the loudest sound, echoing in every mind, making palms sweat, making eyes dart away. Calvin Rourke still stood just feet from her, his arm halfway down from the blow, but now he felt cold at the back of his neck. His eyes darted to the judge, not for apology, but for support. What he found was only a frozen face, a vacant stare. No one moved. The judge said nothing. The clerk had stopped typing. There were no jurors. This case wasn't considered big enough for them, but everyone in the room understood. A new trial had begun, and Amara was the one presiding. There was no microphone, no legal paperwork, only eyes, posture, and resolve. The language of those who don't need power on paper because justice runs in their veins. Rourke's hand dropped, but too slowly. The confidence that had always settled on his face was replaced by something close to fear. Not because of what he did, but because her reaction wasn't what he expected. He'd controlled many courtrooms. Coerced testimony, manipulated with facial expressions, threatened through silence. But he had never faced someone, especially a black woman, who stood before him like this, not with fear, but with understanding. Amara didn't look around for allies. She didn't retreat to the benches, didn't cover her face, didn't turn to leave. She stood there, like an unmovable pillar, forcing the entire room to confront the question no one wanted to answer. If an officer can do this in open court, what has he done when no one was watching? What is he capable of that we can't even imagine? The first to look away was the prosecutor, then a young officer by the door. Neither could meet Amara's eyes, because in them was nothing but truth. Not anger, not hatred, just recognition. She knew what they had chosen to ignore, and she would not let them forget. Rourke clenched his jaw. He considered speaking, explaining, justifying, but his throat was dry. Every word he'd ever used to control a situation now turned to ash in the thick air. Amara, still standing, calmly adjusted the collar of her jacket as if brushing off invisible dust. That tiny gesture, so small it seemed meaningless, made Rourke take a step back. He realized it wasn't his slap that changed her. It was she who was shaking the system, simply by standing still. Rourke tried to swallow, but his mouth was dry as cinders. In over 15 years wearing a badge, he had never felt the ground shift under him so quickly. No one had ever made him retreat just by being there. And now he was backing away, step by step, heart pounding under the unwavering gaze of the woman he had just struck in a court of law. Amara still hadn't said a word, but every eye in the room was now on her, seeking answers. No one looked to the judge anymore. No one sought the record. In that moment, she was not a witness, not a victim. She was the verdict. Rourke had been trained to extinguish fire with tactics. When someone got angry, he'd accuse them of being out of control. When someone demanded justice, he'd claim they were defying the law. But Amara gave him nothing to grab onto. No reaction, no rebellion, just a silence thick as steel coating the room. And the people trained to mask emotion now shook like school children on their first day. Second by second, no one moved. No court officer dared step in. The judge now seemed strangely small, his hands trembling slightly on the bench. Outside the small courtroom window, Charleston's sky remained clear, but inside the yellowed wooden room, the only thing shifting was the structure of power itself. Rourke's eyes darted again, not for support this time, but for escape. But there was no exit for him now, not after what he'd done, not after the way Amara had turned a reaction into strategy. And then, as if she chose the exact moment, she spoke. Just 2 words, soft, firm, like a knife cutting through stone. Not yet. Rourke blinked. Others in the room seemed to stop breathing. Those 2 words held no threat, but everyone understood. This wasn't the moment she would strike. But that moment would come, not by yelling, but by pulling an entire system into the light, piece by piece, person by person. Now, Rourke knew he had hit someone, but hit the wrong one. That behind that silence wasn't weakness. It was a legal engine forged from pain, fueled by denied justice, now waiting for the right time to run. Amara took 1 step forward. Not fast, not threatening, but the room trembled. Not because she was nearing anyone, but because no one knew what she would do next. And that scared them. Some began to lower their heads. People who once saw themselves as mere record keepers, door watchers, just following orders. But in that courtroom, where silence became the primary voice, everyone had to choose, side with the law or side with what is right. And Rourke, who thought himself the center, was now just a man adrift, isolated in the bare truth he could no longer control. Amara didn't need slogans, didn't need a microphone. She only needed to be present, at the right place, at the right time. And for the first time in his life, Rourke understood. Real power doesn't come from a badge. It comes from someone who refuses to bow to one. News didn't spread by radio waves. It spread through glances. Less than 2 hours after the slap, Amara Jefferson's office received the first call from a local reporter. "Do you have any comment on Officer Calvin Rourke's actions in court this morning?" Amara didn't respond, not because she had nothing to say, but because she knew that timely silence could echo louder than any quote. The first image to hit social media was a blurry shot, Rourke's hand still raised, and Amara frozen like a statue. Even though it was grainy, her eyes were unmistakable, still but unyielding. Over a dozen accounts began reposting it. Some called her a victim, others a symbol. But from Amara herself, nothing, not yet. She wasn't rushing to speak, because those used to the spotlight talk first. The ones who act wait for the right moment. The next morning, she sat in a borrowed workspace at a local civic group in Charleston. No cameras, no press, just an old wooden desk, a bland cup of coffee, and a laptop screen filled with tabs about the case of a boy named Micah Bell. His name wasn't in any official press record, no arrest bulletin, no public indictment. That told Amara one thing. From the very start, someone had tried to make the case disappear. She began with the report from the Charleston Police Department. 3 pages, practically void of detail beyond a few timestamps and the usual phrase, "The suspect was non-compliant at the scene." She'd read that line hundreds of times, always in cases where the victim was black and had no legal representation. The first red flag was the time. The report stated Micah was arrested at 8:14 p.m., but the detention center's log recorded his intake at 7:51 p.m., almost 25 minutes before he was supposedly arrested. Mara frowned. No cop is so good they arrest someone before locating them, unless the report was written afterward and filled out to suit the author. She leaned back and opened a tab with footage from a nearby traffic cam, sourced through a contact who'd helped her bypass the rules in past investigations. A grainy frame appeared, Micah standing outside a corner store, holding a bottle of water in one hand, the other in his jacket pocket. No vandalism, no shouting, none of the property damage the indictment claimed. She zoomed in on each frame. A cop approached. Rourke. He didn't chase, didn't signal, just walked up, pushed Micah's shoulder down, and cuffed him. It all happened in under 9 seconds. No explanation. Amara inhaled slowly. She had seen violence, but what choked her wasn't the push. It was how easily it had been rewritten in legal prose. An irrational act, polished into administrative language. Like justice could be formatted in Word. She leaned in and flipped to Micah's intake file, stopping at the Waiver of Legal Counsel section. She froze. The signature at the bottom didn't resemble the handwriting of any 15-year-old, especially not the scratchy scrawl Micah used in the handwritten statement she'd secretly obtained the day before. The signature was forged. Mara's heartbeat slowed. She wasn't a legislator in that moment. She wasn't the woman slapped in court yesterday. She was once again the 19-year-old Amara who had seen her brother's case file cleansed of all real traces. This time, she wouldn't let the truth be erased again. That afternoon, Amara walked into Charleston PD headquarters with a simple request: access to internal records of Micah Bell's arrest, including intake time, Miranda waivers, and footage from the officer's body cam. We're reviewing the entire system. There was a technical error in the data encryption process. Body cam footage is currently inaccessible. She didn't need to hear more. Those answers were too perfect. The kind of perfect that only shows up when someone knows exactly what to say if the right person asks the wrong questions. On her way out, Amara got a text from an unknown number. "Meet at Grant's bookstore, 10 p.m., don't call back." She didn't need to ask who. In court the previous day, one person had stood out, a young court staffer, small frame, eyes that avoided Rourke but occasionally studied Amara. His name was Malik Rowe, and she had guessed right. The back door of Grant's bookstore creaked open as if it had been waiting. Inside was a small room filled with dusty shelves, a dim bulb, and a rattling ceiling fan. Malik sat there, fingers intertwined, shoulders hunched like he carried an unnamed guilt. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice low, shaking. "They monitor everything." "But you still texted me," Amara replied. Malik stayed quiet, then pulled a thick envelope from his coat and set it on the table. Inside were unedited scans of Micah Bell's original file, including the parts missing from the official version. Witness statements with conflicting times, internal notes on non-compliance, and a short clip from a hallway camera showing Micah being led in through the back door instead of the main lobby, in violation of protocol. No warrant, no lawyer, no notification to guardians. Every part of it broke South Carolina law. But in this system, protocol had been sanitized through silent agreement. Malik looked at Amara, eyes brimming. "Well, I've seen a lot, but there are files I never had time to copy. There are other cases, too. You don't understand." "Malik," she interrupted, "I lost a brother to vanishing reports. I understand better than you think." He nodded slowly like a weight had just been removed. Then he said the name. "Calvin Rourke's not the only one." The air in the room shifted. "There's a group, not official, but anyone who's worked here long enough knows. They call it the Rapid Intervention Unit. On paper, it's a field response team. In reality, they're allowed to bypass procedure whenever they deem necessary, usually with young black men. Names? Yes. Malik pulled a small sheet of paper from the envelope. The handwriting was rushed, slanted, but I only got a few. The rest, they're in files no one dares open. Mara looked at the list. Rourke was at the top. Below him were 3 more names she didn't recognize, but wouldn't forget. Brooks, Whitaker, Ellison. They weren't just enforcers, they were part of the selection and execution system for targets. Like Micah. Back at her office, Amara pinned the list to the wall next to Micah's file and courtroom photos. Red strings began to connect the dots. A boy arrested without cause, a SLAP in open court, a shadow network operating beyond legal limits, a system that rewrote reality through administrative language. Amara stood still. No oath needed, no badge. The investigation had officially begun. There are memories that don't need retelling, they live in your bones. Amara Jefferson rarely spoke of Marcus. In her campaign file, he was mentioned only once, younger brother, deceased. But for Amara, Marcus's death wasn't a tragedy. It was an unspoken indictment that justice had never heard. Marcus Jefferson, 17 years old, a senior in high school, accepted into Howard University's summer program. Working part-time at the corner sandwich shop just to save up for a new bike. No gang ties, no smoking, no trouble. He lived quietly, gently, the kind of person society calls a good kid, right up until they need a reason to strike his name from the list of innocent victims. Amara was in her 2nd year of law school at the time. One Friday evening, she got a call from her mother. Just one sentence. Marcus was arrested, but when she got to the police station, there was no one left to bail out. Marcus had already been rushed to the emergency room, broken ribs, internal bleeding, completely unconscious. 3 days later, he died, without a single coherent word, without a final goodbye. The case file read, "Suspect resisted during administrative check." The police said Marcus matched the description of a car theft suspect. They found no weapon, but the report included one line, aggressive attitude. Amara didn't need an investigation to understand what that really meant. It was always the perfect shield for excessive force. She filed a complaint. No response. She requested surveillance footage. The system had a malfunction. She asked for evidence, complaints, witnesses, all labeled not eligible for public disclosure. The case closed after a 3-week internal review. The officers involved were placed on paid leave, then returned to duty like nothing had happened. The Jefferson family received a call from a city representative, a cold condolence and an offer to cover funeral costs. No apology, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and no justice. Mara didn't cry at her brother's casket. She didn't say goodbye. Throughout the funeral, she held a copy of the medical report, each comma like a dull blade. She knew from that moment either she would force this system to tell the truth, or it would keep killing kids like Marcus and rewriting the reason with a single line. She dropped her New York internship and transferred to a civil rights law program. On her first day, she wasn't looking to fit in. She was preparing for a fight, not for revenge, but to give a voice back to those silenced for too long. For nearly a decade, she took on every case her colleagues called hopeless. No cameras, no witnesses, no mercy. She lost many, but every loss was a lesson. Every scar, a map. And every time she stood before a young person arrested without cause, she remembered Marcus's eyes in that hospital bed, wide open, never getting the chance to ask, why? Never understanding what he did wrong. Amara didn't bring her brother's photo into Congress. She didn't keep his picture on her desk, didn't carry a keepsake or write his name into speeches, but he was always there, in every decision she made, every word she wrote into a bill, especially when she stared into the files everyone else wanted to forget, because she knew some wounds don't close, and they shouldn't. That afternoon, after leaving Grant's bookstore and her meeting with Malik Rowe, she sat in silence in her short-term rental in Charleston. No aides, no secretary, No legal staff, just white walls, an investigation map, and her own eyes staring through time at her 17-year-old self. Micah Bell, 15 years old. No one came for him. No lawyer, no argument when he was labeled resistant on paper. Too much like Marcus. Too much like how this system has always worked. Procedurally accurate and factually false. Amara pulled out Micah's incident report and laid it next to Marcus's old file. She compared the phrasing, the structure, the wording, nearly identical. Suspect, uncooperative, aggressive demeanor, no request for legal representation. It was as if copied from a standard template. No, she thought, this isn't human error. This is a model. She started drawing on the wall in red marker, mapping the connections between the names involved. Calvin Rourke, Brooks, Whitaker, Ellison. Officers dubbed rapid response, but in reality, specialists in making the vulnerable vanish from statistics. She marked the 3 judges who had signed off on indictments in suspicious cases. None were disciplined, none investigated, but all were familiar with Rourke. Beneath that, she pinned Malik's note. Same unit. Internally, they refer to each other by badge number, not name. The truth began to surface, not with a punch, but with layer upon layer of paperwork and the sterile language of administrative memos. Amara knew she was up against an iceberg, not something to break with emotion, but to melt with undeniable language. Direction. She opened her laptop and drafted an emergency petition to the federal court, requesting the full records of all arrests involving the named officers over the past 3 years. She attached the recording of her conversation with Malik, voice masked, identifying info stripped, but enough to show that a rogue unit was operating outside the law within Charleston's police. Once sent, she leaned back in her chair, silent. Then the phone rang. Unknown number, no caller ID. She picked up, a man's voice low and deliberate. "We know what you're doing. If you stop now, no one else has to lose anything. But if you don't, the consequences won't stay political." No name needed, no specific threat, just that tone, one she'd heard before. This wasn't the first time they'd tried to crush her with shadows, but it was never the last time she walked through them. Amara hung up. She didn't panic, didn't call the police. She reopened Marcus's file and turned to the note that read, "No on-site camera." Then she wrote on a sheet of paper. This time, someone will see. No longer the sister seeking justice. No longer the congresswoman bargaining with the system. Amara now stood as a living witness and a tracker of the truth. Because when the past doesn't sleep, it brings the truth back with it. On paper, Calvin Rourke was a model officer. 21 years of service, 6 commendations for quick response in dangerous situations. 3-time nominee for Officer of the Year. A local newspaper once called him Charleston's Silent Wall. His photo hung in the police academy's admissions office. Cold stare, crisp uniform, a stance like stone. He was invited to speak at every academy graduation. Spoke of honor, of service, of community, but that's what people were meant to see. What they weren't meant to see, or chose not to, was the list of names, never spoken again. Tucked in internal files. Labeled handled internally or insufficient grounds for misconduct. When Amara started digging through those files, she found familiar names, not because they were famous, but because all of them had been silenced. She found the case of Darnell Woods, 16, arrested while riding his bike home. Police claimed suspicious behavior, no evidence, but Darnell was held for 32 hours without being allowed a phone call. The bruise on his shoulder was recorded as self-inflicted resistance during handcuffing. Rourke was the officer in charge. Then there was Layla Francis, 14, taken to the station for disturbing the peace. In truth, she had been crying outside a pharmacy after being bullied at school. Rourke wrote in the report, "Subject shows signs of agitation. Safety containment advised." No cameras, no one contested it. She was held for 7 hours without her family knowing. Amara circled each name in red. She started to see a pattern. Black, youth, alone, minor or vague offenses, recorded as resisting, held longer than permitted, no legal representation, no press, and at the center of it all, Calvin Rourke, not just writing reports. He was the architect of lawful disappearance, a one-man system turning civil rights violations into standard procedure. In an internal report smuggled to her by Malik Rowe, a performance review described Rourke as someone who handled situations swiftly without media complication and manages documentation to minimize legal exposure. It sounded like praise, but Amara understood this was how abuse was rewritten into achievement. Rourke wasn't just enforcing the rules, he was rewriting the language of the rules to turn crimes into administrative entries. She kept reading. In an internal hearing 4 years earlier, there had been an anonymous complaint alleging Rourke coerced a minor into signing a confession. The investigation was closed. No complainant located, but a note in the file read, "Officer Rourke consistently operates within procedural bounds, encouraged to continue current methods." No one was reprimanded, no one asked questions, because who dares question the model officer of an entire department? Amara knew. No one can hide this much for this long without a wall behind them. She began tracing who signed off on Rourke's reports, who approved the files, who stood guard over the system from within. The first name surfaced like an oil slick: Chief Elliot Granger, Charleston's police chief, once Rourke's academy mentor, and the man who had approved over 80% of Rourke's sensitive cases in the last decade. Granger didn't stand out in the media, but within the department, he was known as the balancer, someone who kept the city looking stable while it rotted underneath. No scandals, no outrageous quotes, no political stunts, just an unwavering policy. Don't let the media interfere with police work. Amar reviewed footage from a 2018 city council meeting. A citizen raised a question about abuse of power by an unnamed officer. Granger responded calmly, "Our system has a strong internal process. If there's misconduct, we'll be the first to know, not the media." And then silence. Granger was the perfect firewall. Not loud, not smug, but effective. He knew that to keep the system alive, it needed people like Rourke, men willing to get their hands dirty without leaving a stain. But Amara didn't just want names. She wanted the structure. She widened her search to cases Rourke had been involved in without being the lead, where he had advised, supported on scene, or coordinated operations. A new batch of names surfaced. Among them, 3 stood out: Brooks, Whitaker, and Ellison, all referenced in Malik's notes. They weren't prominent, no media spotlight, and that made them more suspicious. According to the files, all 3 had above-average arrest rates, and 0 complaints in 5 years. No one arrests at that rate and stays spotless, unless they're shielded from the first step of accountability. Amara returned to purged reports. She traced the records marked incomplete, the security footage labeled temporarily disabled. In over 30 incidents, at least one of those 4 names showed up, directly or indirectly, a network. Not quite a ring, but structured enough to operate like a well-oiled machine. The one who hits, the one who writes, the one who signs off, the one who erases, and one at the top, making sure the city never sees the whole picture. Amara felt the air in the room thicken. Her investigation wall was now covered in names, photos, and diagrams. People once seen as the safe faces of the system are now pieced together into a bloodless mosaic of complicity. She returned to Calvin Rourke's name, framed in the center, no longer just an officer, but the final product of a machine powered by silence and disciplined in all the wrong ways. Rourke wasn't smart enough to erase all traces himself. He didn't need to be. He just had to know when to bow and when to raise his head. And if he was the model the system used to decorate itself, then exposing him wasn't just about tearing down one man. It was about puncturing the moral facade of the whole institution. Amara stared at Rourke's photo. "You weren't built to fail," she whispered. "But I wasn't built to be afraid." Silence. no longer served Amara Jefferson. Ever since she filed a request for records with the federal court, the atmosphere shifted. The receptionist at City Hall no longer smiled when she walked in, the usual barista avoided eye contact as he handed over her coffee, and once she noticed a black SUV parked outside her hotel for 3 hours. No driver, no official plates. She was no longer the brave black woman slapped in a courtroom. She had become someone the system saw as dangerous. One evening, leaving the office late, she spotted a figure standing under a tree behind the building. No movement, no smoking, no reason to be there. When she pretended to turn back and check her phone, the figure vanished. Amara didn't call the police. She knew that if the system had already sent its signal, reporting it would be like sounding an alarm in the woods. No one would come, but the predators would know exactly where she was. She clenched her fist and went back inside. The next day, at the court archive room, Malik Rowe, the digital records clerk, no longer avoided her gaze. Before, he had always kept his head down, as if even a nod might be traced, flagged, and punished. But this time, when she handed over a request for old arrest files, Malik held her eyes a little longer, his look part warning, part promise. That afternoon, an envelope slid under her hotel door. No name, no return address. Inside was a hastily printed page listing 5 internal case codes tied to arrests involving Rourke and 3 others, along with a handwritten note, "Don't let these files die again." Amara recognized Malik's handwriting. He had made his decision not because he believed the system would protect him, but because he knew that silence was complicity. She pulled up the case files linked to the codes he sent. Names of victims, ages, and contexts appeared like a mute map waiting to be read aloud. Among them, one file stood out, that of 10-year-old Jamira Fields, listed as interfering with the scene during a forced eviction with no lawyer, no guardian, no images. Amara traced the file to South Park, the site of an urban restructuring operation. Official records claimed Jamira had gotten in the way during the enforcement, but Malik's note said otherwise. The girl had only been watching. He had written, "She saw, she remembers," and below that, in shaky handwriting, "I'm not just a records clerk anymore." Amara visited the apartment Jamira shared with her grandmother in South Park. A sign on the door read, "Please keep quiet. Elder with heart condition inside." Mrs. Fields, hair silver, eyes wary, nearly slammed the door when Amara introduced herself. But she hesitated when Amara said, "I'm not a reporter. I lost a sibling once to a buried file." Jamira sat in the corner, wild curls, dark eyes, clutching an old notebook. She didn't greet, didn't look up. Amara showed her a grainy image from a traffic camera. It showed an officer pulling a man out of an apartment and a small figure standing against the wall. "Jamira." The girl looked up when Amara gently asked, "Do you know who that man was?" Jamira nodded, but when Amara asked more, the girl whispered, "They said if I tell, they'll take Grandma away." Amara didn't promise protection. She only said, "If one day you're ready, you'll be the reason they can't lie anymore." Jamira said nothing, but her eyes, a mix of childhood and awakening, fear and defiance, spoke enough. Amara left a card with Mrs. Fields. "Anytime you need me, call. I don't work for the system." As she left South Park, Amara knew the truth lived in a child's memory, a memory that had been threatened before the child even understood the law. That night, back in her room, a note lay on the table in red ink. "Don't drag others in," a threat aimed at Malik. An hour later, Malik called from a burner phone. "They're watching me. I'm sending everything," then hung up. At 3 a.m., a courier delivered a craft paper-wrapped package. Inside were a hard drive, memory cards, and a note from Malik. "If I disappear, don't stop." Amara opened the drive. 27 case files involving children, video clips, altered reports, suspicious duty rosters linked to Rourke, handwritten notes from staff. "Keep old version. Do not upload to system." A 32-sec audio clip played Elliot Granger's voice. "If she keeps pushing, separate everyone connected from the system. Start with row. Malik had tapped into the main line, and now he was considered a threat. The final file was a deleted video. It showed Rourke pulling Jamira behind a patrol car. No body cam, but a security camera caught the girl staring directly into the lens. She hadn't interfered. She had only watched, and that was enough for them to want her erased. Amara sat in the dark, screen glowing. File complete. Backup saved. She exhaled, not relief, not triumph, just a breath in the night, while justice remained silent, but truth had already awakened. The file Malik sent wasn't like anything Amara had ever seen. It wasn't an administrative report. It wasn't a court dossier. It was an underground map of the system, where truth wasn't written to be read, but to be hidden. Scrawled faintly on the cover, not registered, not archived, not meant to exist. Inside were internal assignment tracking sheets, encoded by shortening names to just ID numbers and initials, but Malik had decrypted most of it. And each line, each column, each cryptic symbol unfolded into a maze that made one thing clear to anyone stepping in. Justice was never meant to arrive on its own. Amara turned to the first page. A timesheet. It looked harmless, until she cross-checked it with the times of known arrests. Whenever Rourke or his rapid response team were marked on internal shift, an incident occurred, but none had accompanying camera footage. None involved lawyers. Most were never logged in the official system. Next came a performance evaluation chart. Situational impact, high. Media attention generated, low. Note beside it, officer met targeted handling directive, maintained discrete processing. Discrete processing, 3 words as cold as steel. They meant nothing in normal bureaucratic language, but in Amara's hands, the translation was clear. Targeted human handling, sealed off from deviation. She kept reading. An internal memo from February, margin notes from the oversight lead of the task unit, lack of cooperation from legal support team, recommend transferring file verification unit to Officer R. Another line, confirmed log time adjustment system functioning correctly. She paused. Her heartbeat slowed. It wasn't a system glitch. It was a system designed to alter timestamps, to legitimize procedurally flawed arrests. She reopened Micah Bell's case file, cross-referenced it with Malik's timeline. The arrest report stated 8:14 p.m. In truth, according to the internal log, Rourke logged into the system to edit details at 9:2, nearly an hour after the boy had already been locked up. While later she picked up her phone and began recording, voice low and emotionless, like reading a eulogy dictated by fate. Incident dated X. File created post-arrest. No lawyer, no guardian confirmation. Log time altered. Report rewritten. Target handling of vulnerable subjects. Black minors. She didn't need more proof for herself. She needed to make the system confront what it had written in its own hand. Amara knew if she wanted to take this system down, she couldn't stop at the hands that carried out the acts. She had to expose the ones who opened the door for Rourke and closed it when the victims fell. She began with what the system assumed no one would ever notice. Signatures. Every altered file had an approver, not Rourke, the final gatekeeper in the system. Under each intervention was an authentication code. Malik had extracted and linked 3 names, J. Halston, R. Ellery, and one labeled only Admin G3J Halston, a mid-level operations coordinator, former deputy assistant to the Deputy Director of Internal Affairs. Her resume highlighted her ability to expedite urgent files and censure consistent internal optics. Amara understood then Halston wasn't a clerk. She was a filter, a redactor, the one who let truth slip away under black ink and official procedure. R. Ellery, former internal affairs investigator now working in the police department's legal division. He authored at least 14 inconclusive misconduct reports in cases involving Rourke. Every one of them was closed swiftly, without interviewing witnesses. As for Admin G3, no name, no job title, but from the system Malik recovered, it was the top-tier administrator account, granted only to someone authorized to overwrite system activity logs. The login traced to an IP inside the chief of police's office. She marked the name, Elliot Granger. He didn't need to issue direct orders. All he had to do was turn the green light on. By setting no boundaries, Amara reopened her investigation chart. The names were no longer connected by thin threads. They were ropes, and they were tightening around the necks of those who had tied them. She laid Rourke's reports side by side. Below each, an approving signature. Behind each, a data gatekeeper. Above all, a budget overseer. No one threw a punch. No one held the cuffs, but all of them pulled the rope that gagged just as she reread Malik's final note. Some never appear in photos, but they're the ones adjusting the light. Amara wondered how many years had these people lived in the spotlight of titles while acting like ghosts in the machine. She sent a full digital copy of the documents to a civil rights law team in D.C., people she'd worked with when she was still a human rights lawyer. No introduction, no warning, just the subject line. Time to see them, because once light hits the right place, no one can claim they were just doing their job. Monday morning, South Carolina State Civil Rights Council headquarters. Amara Jefferson walked in, not as a legislator, not as a lawyer. Today she came as a carrier of truth, truth that had never been spoken in hearings, never reported in press, and certainly never seen by anyone sitting in that room. On the table were 3 printed files. One, a dossier on Rourke and the Rapid Response Unit, including names, wrongful arrest records, and timestamp alterations. 2, a network trace of admin G3's activity, confirming systemic tampering from an IP inside the chief's office. 3, internal emails between Halston, Ellery, and an unnamed legal aide discussing how to legally frame juvenile detainment records to avoid media scrutiny. No preamble, no tears, no outrage. Amara said only, "I'm not here to request an investigation. I'm here to demand action. And this is the point where you choose, protect your reputation or protect the truth." The room fell silent. One council member, a white man, silver-haired, deep voice, asked, "Where did you get these documents?" Amara stared straight ahead, from a system insider who disappeared after sending them. And if you do nothing, the next to disappear could be a child. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was fear. Because for the first time, the truth wasn't just data. It had a witness. It wasn't just a story. It had legal standing. It wasn't just an accusation. It was a lawful threat. That same day, the council voted to call an emergency hearing and granted Amara's entire file federal protection status, meaning anyone who tried to destroy, alter, or obstruct it would face federal prosecution beyond Charleston's jurisdiction. Later that afternoon, Amara received an anonymous email. "You just kicked the hornet's nest. But don't forget, some of those hornets will come for you." She didn't reply instead. She went on local TV, publicly releasing the full documents for the first time, declaring to the camera, "Those who were arrested are not system errors. We let the system be designed to target exactly who it wanted to remove. And if we don't change it at the root, every reform will just be a new name on old paper." The story spread fast. Independent media published network maps. Investigative journalists reached out for access to the files. A week later, Police Chief Elliot Granger appeared on television in a gray suit with a slight smile and a textbook statement, "The department will fully cooperate with the federal investigation. We have nothing to hide." But when the cameras stopped rolling, he knew. The door Amara had opened wasn't a legal one. It was shattered, and on the other side was a system that could no longer be closed. Micah Bell used to be a name no one remembered. No headlines, no mention at parent-teacher meetings. No photo going viral with an angry hashtag. Micah simply vanished. Arrested outside a convenience store. No clear offense, no evidence, no camera. No one called his mother. No one notified his school. And worst of all, no one asked, "Where is that boy?" By the time Amara found Micah's file, the real one, not the version edited, in the system, nearly a month had passed. The intake photo showed it clearly. A split lip, swollen eye, a scratch on his neck as if he'd been yanked hard, but in the medical notes there was only one line: injury not severe, no specialized treatment required. Next to it a signature: in-house medical unit, J.H. Noel, doctor. No nurse, no clinic info. Just one person, Janice Halston. The same person Amara had previously tracked as the one who approved a series of suspicious methods. She circled the line in red ink. When the civil rights legal team received the copy, their response was brief. If this file is real, it's evidence of unlawful arrest and intentional falsification of medical records. Amara didn't wait for the system to speak. She went directly to Micah's mother, Tasha Bell, a night shift worker at a roadside diner who had declined every press interview because she didn't want trouble. When Amara showed her the file, Mrs. Bell didn't cry. He just said one hoarse sentence. I thought he ran away. I thought he chose not to come home. In that moment, Amara saw the clearest form of damage the system could cause. When a mother is made to believe her child chose their own suffering, Mrs. Bell looked down, hands clenched tightly. I called the police 3 times. At first, they said no one by that name. Then they said I needed legal authority. I didn't know what I needed just to ask about my own child. Amara nodded. Well, now you have everything you need. Back at her office, Amara began drafting a petition, requesting the federal court reopen the case of Micah Bell, summon all personnel involved in his arrest and detention, and place Micah under independent legal protection. But before submitting, she looked at the boy's photo. Swollen eyes, cracked mouth, still trying to look straight into the camera. No tears, no closed eyes, no bowed heads. The gaze of a child who still didn't understand why he was beaten and why everyone stayed silent. The day Amara officially filed the petition to reopen Micah Bell's case, a chain reaction began, not from the courts, from the press. A local news site, previously silent after Rourke's assault, suddenly published a 2,000-word article titled "The Congresswoman and the Witch Hunt: When Politics Overtakes Justice." The piece implied Amara was exploiting a teenager's image for attention, calling her actions interference in a legal internal process, and turning an administrative case into a political attack. No mention of Micah's injuries, no review of the medical report, no note that his mother had never been notified. Just one stream of content: suspicion, distortion, and spin. Amara wasn't surprised. She knew too well how the system builds smoke to cover the fire. But this time, the smoke spread fast. 3 TV channels echoed the same angle. Congresswoman Jefferson overstepping authority, civil rights crusade or political theater, 15-year-old, and the question of manipulated evidence. Even inside the Charleston courts, a quiet backlash began. Clerks stopped responding to filings on time. The federal public defender's office didn't confirm receipt of a request. The system didn't shut down. It recoiled like a wounded animal and began to strike back. Amara had expected this, but she hadn't expected it to be so cruel that they'd turned the attack onto Micah himself. The 3 days after she filed, someone claiming to be an anonymous source from the police department began leaking details of Micah's troubled history. An old disciplinary record surfaced, no criminal charge, just a note from a teacher. Uncooperative in class. From a boy arrested without cause, Micah was now being painted as a problem child. Amara stayed silent. No fiery rebuttals, no press conferences. Instead, she did something simple. She went to see Micah. He sat curled in the corner of his small living room, feet on the chair. His eyes no longer afraid, just empty. "You're here to tell everyone I'm not bad, right?" Micah asked, eyes unblinking. Amara crouched down. She didn't answer right away. She reached into her bag, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and handed him a pen. "You don't need to tell me what happened, just let me know. What do you want people to call you when they talk about you?" Micah stared at the paper for a long time. Then, slowly, with shaky but firm handwriting, he wrote, "The boy who didn't deserve to be forgotten." Amara nodded. "Then you won't be." Amara knew if the system got to define Micah through its old records, he'd be erased again, this time in the eyes of the public. So So she changed tactics. No press conferences, no mainstream media. She chose to live stream, a simple setup, a wooden table, a single camera, no crew, no director. Just her, a glass of water, and a thick file resting beside a school notebook. Micah wasn't present, but his name was centered in the frame. Bold, clear, Amara began with a question. Have you ever been accused by people who never gave you a chance to defend yourself? Then she told the story, not with rage, but piece by piece, from Micah's arrest to his illegal detention, to the bruises, to his mother's voice, and finally to the line he wrote, "The boy who didn't deserve to be forgotten." Amara didn't ask viewers to share, didn't beg them to believe. She simply placed what the system tried to hide in front of the lens, and let the public ask, why were none of these things ever mentioned? Within 3 hours, the video had over 100,000 views. 6 hours later, a prominent civil rights attorney reposted it with a caption, "This isn't a new George Floyd. This is the original version, where cruelty doesn't need a knee on a neck, just a name crossed out of a file." The next day, an online petition calling for a full investigation into Micah Bell's case gathered over 150,000 signatures. Teachers and parents began sharing posts about students, labeled as disruptive just for being silent. The movement was no longer about politics. It was about one thing: identity, dignity, and the right to be seen. The federal court was forced to respond to Amara's petition earlier than expected. In the preliminary hearing, the judge asked one question. "Attorney Jefferson, what exactly are you seeking here?" Amara answered without notes. "We're not asking for compensation, not asking for anyone to be fired immediately. We are asking for what every citizen should be entitled to: an honest record, a legal process, and a name that isn't erased for lacking the power to stay visible." Micah wasn't present in court that day, but for the first time, the media didn't call him a troubled teen. On the news, his name appeared with a new phrase, "detained without due process." For the first time, his name wasn't rewritten, it was written right. And Amara knew. She hadn't won, but she had done what the system couldn't undo: restored a face. And with it would come more faces, more voices, more victims once reduced to numbers, because no one deserves to be forgotten. The black folder had no title. It arrived in a hand-delivered package, no postmark, no official recipient. Inside was a small USB stick sealed with silver tape and a handwritten note. None of them were ever spoken of. "Now's the time." Amara plugged the drive into her laptop, fingers gripping the mouse as if afraid that the moment she let go, what she was about to see would vanish. Again, the folder was named list_27_internal_only. Inside were PDF files, each showing a string of ID numbers, a timestamp, and a name. In total, 1,007 files, 27 cases, 27 people. Amara opened them one by one. Each name read like a silent indictment. To Troy Bennett, detained for 16 hours under suspicion of vandalism. No evidence found. His mother was never contacted. Kendra Moss, age 11, labeled in the report as uncontrollable at school, taken to the police station for psychological evaluation. No guardian signature. Louis Pineda, age 15, suffered a dislocated shoulder during restraint. Medical reports stated self-inflicted injury during restraint. No camera, no independent physician. All cases shared the same pattern, ages between 10 and 17. Children of color, low-income families, or no legal representation. Involved officers: Calvin Rourke, James Ellison, Dana Whitaker, Tyler Brooks. Case status: handled internally, not escalated. Final approver: admin G3. Amara sat in silence. In the quiet room, only the computer hum and the deep thud of her own heartbeat could be heard. This list wasn't evidence of a single crime. It was the testimony of a system fully aware of its actions and deliberately repeating them. At the bottom of each file, a checkbox was marked, "Do not recontact." She bit her lip. That meant they had reached out only to confirm these people would never be acknowledged again. It had reversed kind of agreement, no formal threats, no signatures, just disappearance, exhaustion, endurance, and names swept out of the system like dust beneath the floorboards. Amara picked up a marker and wrote on the whiteboard in her office, "We cannot save anyone if we allow them to be forgotten." She didn't need many. She only needed one name to rise from silence. She chose Troy Bennett to start, not just because he had been detained for 16 hours without formal charges, something the system coldly described as non-prosecutorial detainment. She chose Troy because of a rare note in the final file. Requires long-term observation to plan note, shows tendency to question authority. That line stopped her, not because of what it implied, but because asking questions was now considered a threat. Troy was now 19, living in a run-down apartment near the bus terminal. Amara tracked him down using an address from his mother's old hospital file. It took 3 days of talking to neighbors before she was led to a ground-floor unit, with peeling wood doors and a rusted iron fence barely standing. The young man who opened the door looked wary, not scared, just someone too used to people showing up only to take something and leave. "Are you a reporter?" Troy asked. "No," Amara said. "I'm someone trying to return what they stole from you, without leaving fingerprints." Troy paused, then opened the door. The room was small, with thin walls, a wobbly table propped up by old books. On the wall, a handwritten note in red ink. "If you talk, they'll open your mother's file." Amara saw it, said nothing. She sat down, opened her bag, and pulled out a printed copy of the internally handled file on Troy. She didn't need to explain. He had already seen his name in it. "Has anyone ever believed you?" she asked quietly. Troy shook his head. "When I told my mom, she thought I made it up. Teachers said not to stir up trouble. My friends disappeared one by one. And the police?" "Police?" Troy gave a dry laugh. "It took me a year just to walk past the station without wanting to throw up." Amara let him talk. She didn't interrupt. "You know what?" Troy whispered. "They didn't even need to hit me. Just put me in a cold room and said, 'If you don't cooperate, we'll attach charges to your mom's record.'" He looked out the window. "So, I shut up for 6 years." The room was silent like blank paper, but to Amara, it was the loudest thing she'd ever heard, because it wasn't a scream. It was a confession from a system that taught people silence was the only way to keep their loved ones safe. She took out a form, a federal witness protection alias affidavit. "Troy, do you want this story to be told, for the first time, by the one who actually lived it?" He looked at the paper, his hands like stone. 1 minute, 2, then 3. Finally, Troy nodded. "If you're still standing, then I won't sit anymore." One name had spoken, and that was enough to start a chain reaction the system never saw coming. Amara began doing something simple, but revolutionary inside a system built to keep people apart. She connected them. From Troy Bennett, she reached out to Kendra Moss, detained at 11. Now a high school senior, her hair braided into tight knots, her eyes wary like every adult might be another captor. But when she heard Troy's name, her eyes softened. "He remembers?" Kendra asked, then whispered, "I thought I was the only one who still dreamed about it." It didn't take much to persuade her. She said, "As long as I'm not speaking alone," Amara promised. No one speaks alone anymore. Weeks later, she met with 7 others from the list, or their families. Each had once been silenced. Each had once believed their story wasn't big enough to be heard. But knowing that others were buried under the same type of file, the same kind of threat, the same forced silence, that changed the fear. She rented a small community room behind a church in East Haven, called it Room 27. At first, only Troy and Kendra came, then 2 more, then 3. No one was asked to share. No cameras, just a space to be present, with each other, no ID badges, no transcripts. One night, after telling his story, a young man named Isaiah, detained at 14 for attitude during a stop, stood and said, "They erased my face from the record. But here, I get it back." The room went quiet. Then, applause, not loud, but solid. Amara looked at them, not as files, but as witnesses rewriting how local history would be remembered. She asked them to write their stories by hand. No emails, no typing, just ink and paper, because handwriting carries a weight no system can scrub away. They called it 27 who were forgotten. She sent the first collection to the federal office with a simple note, "This is not a petition. This is testimony." A week later, the State Justice Department press room was packed, not for a special event, but because Amara announced something no one expected. The list of 27 previously handled internally is now a list of people publicly naming themselves to reclaim justice. None of them wanted compensation, no fame, just one thing: to be recognized as real, not as numbers, not as internal records, but as people with memories, pain, and the right to speak. For the first time in years, the names once erased had become milestones, and history was no longer the privilege of those allowed to write it. The doors to Charleston's power supermarket opened for the third time, carrying with them an eerie stillness. Police Chief Elliot Granger entered. No security detail, no assistant, no mayor's sash, just him. Salt and pepper hair, firm stance, seasoned eyes, and the room held its breath. He didn't perform. No signaling to the press, no microphones, no cameras, no statements. He walked straight to the city council's inquiry table, where Amara Jefferson had waited 7 days for her first official round of questions. The tension wasn't because of the weight of his position. It was because everyone knew Elliot Granger never showed up unless it was absolutely necessary, and if he was here, it was because he was still in control, not cornered. Amara sat across from him. It was her first time seeing Granger in the flesh, not through files or second-hand descriptions, and the feeling was suspicious. Nothing cold, no edges like Rourke, no broken promises, no false toughness. Granger was something else entirely. The polished civility refined to mask a lifetime of manipulation. "Mrs. Jefferson?" He nodded, voice low and steady. "I'm not here to debate. I'm here to clarify." Amara smiled. "So am I, but not to clarify with you, with the system you're tasked with guarding." The hearing wasn't loud, not as dramatic as the media had hoped. But every answer, every time Granger sidestepped a direct question, every time he invoked internal procedures instead of offering clarity, made Amara more certain this man wasn't just part of the problem, he was its core. The files Malik had leaked included 9 logins using the admin G3 access code. 7 of them originated from servers located inside the chief's office. No names, no direct user. But the timestamps aligned perfectly with Granger's personal schedule. When Amara asked, "Have you ever accessed the internal system to modify arrest records?" Granger offered a soft smile. "I'm not a technician. I've never touched a control panel." A clean denial. Not a lie, but slippery enough to avoid accountability. Amara placed the printout of the logs on the table. "Maybe you didn't type, but someone used top-level access from inside your office? At the exact moments files were deleted or altered." Granger, he looked at her. "Do you have proof it was me?" A good question, not because of its content, but its tone. Elliot Granger didn't deny the action. He only denied the possibility of being caught. Amara didn't reply. She simply nodded, then calmly placed a statement from a former IT staffer on the table. Someone who'd been asked to create a secondary admin profile for night maintenance at the direct request of the chief's office. A single line on the page read, "I never saw the profile used for maintenance. It was used to retain things that could cause trouble." Granger stared at the page, then at Amara. Not angry, not shaken, recalculating. He understood. The woman before him wasn't here to win. She was here to ensure he could no longer remain silent. When Granger left the room, he said nothing about the 27 cases, nothing about the tampered logs, nothing about the rapid response unit. But Amara knew the truly powerful don't react in the moment. They strike from where she can't yet see. And right on cue, within 48 hours, an article appeared in a major economic magazine. Granger, Stability in Chaos. The Quiet Leadership of a Divided City. It was funded by the Charleston Community Restructuring Fund, an organization Amara had already investigated, one that had pumped millions into neighborhood reform projects in South Park, the same area linked to multiple wrongful evictions from her case list. She dug into the fund's history. At the top, James Linderman, a wealthy businessman, close with Granger since academy days. In an interview 3 years ago, Linderman had said, "Charleston needs men like Granger. No need for noise, just someone who keeps things running in the right direction. A phrase meant to praise, but in the hands of people like them, it meant right for whoever holds the map." Mara continued her research, discovering special budget transfers made to the police chief's office from the high-risk area Rapid Response Fund. It sounded like a safety initiative. But when she cross-checked the data, the timing matched Granger didn't just manipulate the system. He fed it with money, with networks, with whispered instructions behind closed doors. People like Rourke didn't exist on their own. They were sustained by those who knew how to turn wrongdoing into a stabilizing force. Amara called a former city finance assistant who had resigned after refusing to approve a suspicious budget request. Over the phone, her voice was curt, but upon hearing who was calling, she paused, then said, "Granger doesn't run the system. He makes the system feel essential. So people believe that without him, the city falls." And that was the core. Not fear of Rourke, not brute force, but the belief that silence equals stability. But Amara wasn't here to stay silent anymore. She organized a second public hearing, not to bring more evidence, but to show the architecture of the system Granger had built. Not just names, but relationships, transactions, transfers, political deals, grants, and conveniently timed arrests right before neighborhoods were scheduled for redevelopment. She put it all on screen. No drama, no raised voice, just the language of spreadsheets, maps, and a clear conclusion. If victims are the price of preserving stability, then this isn't a system. It's internal colonization, built by those who claim to protect the community. The media began to pivot. They stopped calling her an agitator, stopped calling Micah Bell a troubled teen. They started using a new term, complicit structures. Inside Charleston PD, one thing went unspoken but widely understood. Elliot Granger never retreats. He was the wall, the pillar, the guardian keeping the machine quiet, stable, and under control. But walls don't fall from hammers. They fall when the bricks begin to slide out on their own. 3 days after Amara's hearing, an anonymous email arrived in the inbox of the State Internal Review Committee. Subject: confirmed manipulation model inside Charleston PD. The sender claimed to be a former deputy financial auditor for the Charleston Community Safety Fund who had once approved budgets for rapid response programs. Attached were 3 meeting transcripts, in which Granger directly requested priority incident handling in soon-to-be redeveloped zones. A highlighted excerpt stood out. "No need to wait on reports. We can't let kids start a movement right when we're applying for state funding. No names." But the voice in the attached audio file, low, clear, each word like a tactical order, was unmistakable. It was Granger. Then, a shock. The deputy director, long considered Granger's silent successor, resigned. No press conference, no statement. Just one line in the resignation letter. "I can't continue working within a system I no longer believe serves the community." The first domino fell. Then the second, a legal counsel from the police department, long thought to be the author of the by-the-book legal shields, issued a public apology to one of the 27 listed victims. In the letter she wrote, "I didn't have the courage to speak out then, but I will no longer write to erase someone's name." Now the press didn't need Amara to guide them. They launched their own investigations. A statewide TV expose aired, "The Gatekeeper, Elliot Granger, and the Network of Silence." At a special city council session, Granger was asked to appear one last time for a formal response. Amara was there. This time, she didn't interrogate, didn't present. She simply sat, listening, the way victims of the system had been forced to sit in silence for years. Granger stood, still solid, still composed like ancient stone. But now, that stone was starting to crack. "We've worked tirelessly to preserve order," he said, "and in some cases we had to make difficult decisions. one council member asked. Do you deny responsibility for data tampering, improper arrest approvals, and file suppression? Granger paused, then replied, in these times, people can look at the same event and call it justice or abuse. All I know is, I kept this city from falling apart. Amara stood, no permission, no microphone. She simply said, you kept the city from falling apart, but you didn't keep its soul intact. No applause, no laughter. But the entire room was still, and for the first time in years, Elliot Granger was no longer the center of power. He was someone who had to listen. After the hearing with Elliot Granger, an eerie quiet settled over Charleston. No more press calls, no more rebuttal articles, no official statements from the police department. In the media, everything seemed to be waiting for a formal investigation, for a policy statement. But Amara knew better than anyone, when the powerful fall silent, it isn't because they've lost, it's because they're planning their strike. The first message arrived at 2 a.m. No sender name, just a blurry photo of the back of her head as she left the hearing the day before. Alongside it, one line, you know too much to keep walking alone. She didn't flinch, didn't react, just took a screenshot, forwarded it to her legal team, and wrote in her journal, Marker 1, indirect threat, personal surveillance. 2 days later, Malik Rowe, the whistleblower behind most of the internal documents, called Amara. His voice was steady, but oddly clipped. They've transferred me. Records unit. 200 miles north. No reason, no formal notice. I just showed up and my desk was locked. Email account disabled. Amara asked, were you threatened? Malik exhaled. Not verbally, but when I reached for my personal USB, a hallway officer rested his hand on his belt. She gripped her phone, not out of surprise, but because this was exactly what she expected. They wouldn't go for the weak spots, they'd attack the silence, push people away, make those who remain feel alone. By week's end, the worst news hit. Kendra Moss, the 11-year-old girl who had once been wrongfully arrested and later became one of the first brave witnesses, was in a car accident. Not fatal, but a broken leg and soft tissue injuries. The car that hit her fled the scene. Traffic cams were down at the time. Initial police finding, insufficient data to determine motive. Amara rushed to the hospital that same night. Kendra didn't cry, didn't ask anything. She just said, I knew something was coming. I just hope this time it doesn't disappear like it did all those other years. Amara placed her hand gently over the girl's and nodded slowly. This time is different, but you have to hold strong. The more they want us quiet, the louder we need to live. Kendra nodded. She didn't need to promise. Her presence, breathing, remembering, was the vow. At 2 a.m., Amara returned home and found a nameless email. One sentence, you can't protect everyone, and the price of truth is always loneliness. She didn't reply. Instead, she wrote in her notebook, pressing hard enough to tear the edge of the paper, I don't need to be safe. I just need truth, not to die in silence. Amara didn't hire bodyguards. Didn't move, didn't ask for state protection. She didn't trust the public safety measures handed down by the very system she was exposing. They could turn into tools of control with a single internal memo. Instead, she prepared like she was already in a war zone. On the 4th day after Kendra's accident, Amara called an informal legal council. 3 civil rights attorneys, a cybersecurity expert, and a veteran whistleblower advocate. They didn't meet at her office. They gathered in a dusty children's reading room behind an old bookstore near the night market, abandoned for years. She opened her laptop and projected 3 maps, a diagram of internal data manipulation, a timeline of coincidental threats and accidents in recent days, a map of personal and financial ties among those who had shielded Rourke. She didn't need to say much, just asked, if I disappear, what happens next? One of them replied, we won't let you disappear. But Amara shook her head. I'm not asking for comfort. I'm asking to make sure that if it happens, the story doesn't die with me. After a few moments of silence, every head nodded. The meeting ended with a silent pact. Every new piece of evidence would be encrypted and backed up in 3 separate locations. All potentially targeted witnesses would be connected with independent legal monitors. And most important, Every threat would be exposed publicly, not handled quietly, but named as an intentional act. Amara didn't choose a reaction strategy. She chose an exposure strategy. That night, as she returned to her apartment, someone was waiting by her door. A middle-aged man in a worn coat, cap pulled low. His face was familiar, but it took Amara a moment to place him. Lamar Hensley, former Internal Affairs Inspector at Charleston PD. He'd signed off on 4 of the no evidence of misconduct reports tied to Rourke. "What are you here for?" Amara asked, keeping the door partially closed. "Not to apologize," he said. "I came because I have the name you need." She didn't ask what name, just stepped aside. Hensley walked in, removed his cap, and placed a USB on the table. "These are internal conversation logs between Granger and his policy advisors, where he called those 27 cases social blind spots we can control." Amara said nothing. Hensley added, "I used to think keeping the peace was best, but now I can't sleep knowing children became corrupted, lines in a database." He stood. "I won't testify, but I won't stand in your way anymore." The door closed, but another had just opened. Amara looked at the USB. In the dim yellow light, it seemed small. What in the gut was inside? It was the first crack from the very center of a system that had once felt untouchable. Less than a week after the USB was handed to her legal team, Amara received an official summons from the State Inspector General's office. Not to testify, not as a witness, but to respond to allegations of abuse of power and unauthorized use of internal data. She stared at the document, red-stamped, urgent, its language polished and cold, like it wasn't talking about a woman who exposed 27 civil rights violations, but a shady figure who stole data for personal gain. No named accuser, no clear list of which files were compromised, just one intent: undermine her legitimacy. The next morning, a national newspaper's analysis and commentary column ran the headline, "From Legislator to Whistleblower. Now defendant, no evidence, just sources say, insiders believe, and experts raise concerns." That style wasn't meant to prove her wrong. It only needed to plant one question: if she's not clean, can any of her claims be trusted? Amara wasn't surprised. This was the oldest trick in asymmetric warfare. When you can't disprove the message, attack the messenger. That night, she gathered her legal team. "This is the phase where they want me to back down," she said, "to shift me from the one asking questions to the one forced to justify her own existence." One lawyer asked, "Will you counter-sue?" Amara shook her head. "No. If I sue them for defamation, I make this a personal spat. But if I show the world this is how the system treats anyone who speaks the truth, I turn their attack into my final piece of evidence." She began preparing a personal video statement, not to defend herself, but to publicly lay out the exact process she followed. From the moment she received Micah Bell's file, to her witness interviews, her encrypted storage methods, and, most critically, the protocols that ensured no one but victims could alter the data she collected. She ended the video with one line: "I don't need others to prove I'm right. I just need them to look at what I've shown and ask, if I'm wrong, why have the guilty never spoken up?" 48 hours later, the video had over 2 million views. Independent legal experts reposted it, among them a Harvard law professor. No one walks into fire without the truth in hand. The only way to break someone like Amara is to distort her role, and that's how you know she's on the right path. In the shadows, the system thought it had cornered Amara, but no one knew. She had lived in the shadows for a long time, and it was there she learned how to turn silence into echo. There was no big backdrop, no pre-built stage. Amara held the press conference outdoors, in a small courtyard behind an old community library that once served as a shelter for black students expelled during segregation. In front of her weren't national media outlets. It was local teachers, high school students, people who had signed the petition for Micah Bell, and a few independent journalists with phones mounted on tripods. Her speech didn't begin with "Ladies and gentlemen." It began with, "If you were ever taught that silence is the only way to survive, then today I'm here to tell you they lied to you." She didn't speak defensively. She didn't read from a prepared statement. She opened each file, one by one. Micah Bell, Kendra Moss, Troy Bennett, and names no one had ever heard. She presented original photos showing signs of tampering, decoded internal reports once encrypted, eyewitness testimonies, financial trails funding units tasked with handling residents, and most notably, a copy of testimony from Lamar Hensley, once deep inside the system, now the first to pull the cord. She didn't isolate individuals. She made connections, from Rourke to Granger, from the police to budget lines, from one SLAP to a city quietly manipulated. "This isn't my story anymore," she said, looking straight into the lens. "This is the story of everyone who's ever been silenced. Not because they didn't have a voice, but because they were taught no one wanted to hear it." A young woman stood from the back row. She wore a faded shirt, holding a printed copy of her son's record. "Detained for 12 hours for loitering near school," she said. "I thought it was just my son. Now I know he's not alone." Then an elderly man stood up. He spoke of his nephew, forced out of a rental home before the lease was up. Reason, potential disruption. Voices spread. Not loud, not with banners, just honest words, rising after years of being swallowed. Amara didn't need to shout. She just needed to stand, like a flame in the wind, steady enough to show those still in the dark. It was finally their time to step out. 3 days after Amara's press conference, something unusual began happening in Charleston schools. No protests, no riots, just scraps of paper, pinned to bulletin boards, lampposts, even tucked inside students' lunchboxes, each with one sentence: "I have a voice, and I'm not hiding it anymore." That afternoon, a group of 10th graders at James Baldwin High stood up during civics class, asking to share stories of being randomly searched on campus. The teacher started to stop them, then quietly sat down and listened. 2 days later, a group of parents held a private meeting with the school board, demanding a review of all protocols between schools and school police. They brought copies of Amara's report, highlighting how similar cases were swept under internal resolution. The media couldn't ignore it anymore. A local news station launched a special segment titled "Voices No Longer Hidden," a special report on forgotten justice. For the first time, national networks called Amara not to challenge, but to ask. She didn't have to seek out the public came to her. At a Sunday prayer service at Mount Salem Church, the elderly pastor stood at the wooden pulpit, his voice gravelly but steady. "We used to teach our children that if they behaved well, they'd be safe. But now we must ask, if being good isn't enough to protect them, then what do we teach them next?" The church went silent, then someone clapped, then another, then the whole room. No one needed organizing, no leader required, because everyone understood if they didn't speak up now, another child would be filed away with no one to defend them. The movement no longer carried Amara Jefferson's name. It carried the names of those once forced into silence: Troy, Kendra, Micah, Isaiah, Jamira. Each community picked a name from the list of 27 to host a story-sharing event, not to relive the pain, but to say, "We were erased, but now we are the ones rewriting." Amara watched the images unfold on her phone. A little girl reading poetry at the community library. An old man holding a carved wooden plaque with his grandson's name. A student group hosting a Trace the Erasure forum. No one had to shout. They just needed to step into the light together once. And it was enough to make the entire system stop. Once they stayed silent out of fear, but now the truth had too many voices to be silenced, and the system knew it. Just 1 week after the movement swept Charleston, a group of filed a petition to the city council demanding a review of the legality of Congresswoman Jefferson's independent investigations. They called it a unilateral action eroding public trust in official agencies. The petition was signed by major business owners, former police officials, and attorneys who had defended the South Park housing evictions. The media labeled it the orderly response. Amara understood. This was the last blow from those who had lived too long in the shadows of power, where every shift was a threat. But this time, they weren't just targeting her. They were targeting the entire movement, trying to brand it with old terms: instigators, anti-system, civil unrest. The day the petition went to council, Amara said nothing. She didn't need to. When she entered the chamber, over 200 people stood waiting. No signs, no chants, just stillness. Eyes fixed on the officials preparing to vote. Troy Bennett sat in the front row, white shirt buttoned. Kendra Moss stood on crutches beside her former teacher. Micah Bell wore a shirt that read, "I wasn't erased. I was A middle-aged man stood to speak before the council. "I used to be an officer. I used to believe keeping things quiet was how you kept a city stable. But today I see silence isn't stability. Silence is paralysis. And she, Amara Jefferson, woke us up." An elderly woman raised a copy of her grandson's old file. They called him a disruption, but all he asked was, "Why was I arrested without explanation? If that question is a threat, then maybe you should be afraid." No one interrupted, no one dared. In the end, the petition was rejected, not just for lack of votes, but because no one had the nerve to look 200 former nameless victims in the eye and say their voices were wrong. Amara stepped out of City Hall, flanked by people lining the walkway on both sides. No clapping, no cheering, just eyes that met hers. A nod, a hand on her shoulder, a quiet touch on her back. No leader, no followers, just a community stepping out of the dark together. And for the first time in years, Charleston was no longer the city of hidden voices. It was a place where truth had learned to speak for itself, and those once taught to stay silent were now the ones rewriting how history would be remembered. This time, the file didn't come from a lawyer. It didn't come from a witness. It came from a young, quiet network technician working at a private security firm, someone who had silently watched Charleston's entire wave of resistance unfold from behind lines of encrypted code. He left the USB on a cafe table with a brief message in an email. "You're striking the center, but there's a layer beneath. They don't write reports. They don't wear uniforms, but they patrol, and they target the pawn, not the king, not the officials, but the unprotected children." Inside the USB was a digital map created with behavioral surveillance software, supposedly designed for crime-prone zones. But this wasn't tracking criminals. It was tracking students. Their movement data had been collected by surveillance devices mounted on private patrol vehicles, not part of the official police force, unmarked and operating without warrant. The data showed these vehicles moved through school corridors, residential areas, and convenience stores. They lingered longest in neighborhoods with high black population density. No formal legal interactions were recorded, but within 72 hours of their presence, there was always at least one administrative detention in the exact same area, at the exact same time slot. Not a coincidence. Amara had no doubt. This was an intentional underground patrol network, created to pave the way for legitimized arrests later. She traced the financial contracts. Most were signed under the label Flexible Community Monitoring Services, funded through the Urban Security Assistance Fund, a branch still under the influence of Elliot Granger's old office. Amara marked the board in her office with a red pen. This was no longer a network, no longer scattered events. It was a predatory system, operating outside the law but fed by legal budgets. They didn't need reports. They didn't leave arrest records. They only needed to show up, apply pressure, stir tension, and vanish. The rest, the formal system would take care of. A student standing near a convenience store, marked as suspicious congregation. A teenager walking through a quiet park, photographed as presence in potential risk zone. A young girl reading on a stoop, logged as disoriented, requires monitoring. None of these names appeared in police records, but their identities were stored elsewhere, in a soft target list. Amara called her legal team. "They're doing something no law currently names, which means no law forbids it, but the harm is real." One lawyer replied, "We need to prove they didn't just stumble onto this. They were actively targeting a group." Amara nodded. "No one installs behavioral surveillance on civilian vehicles by accident. They know exactly what they're doing. The real question is, who gave them permission? She started calling the first names on the soft target list. A 14-year-old girl, a high school student once pulled into the principal's office for unusual walking patterns on campus. A 12-year-old boy, once photographed near a laundromat and days later had his backpack searched on the way to school. All had one thing in common. None had broken the law, but all had been viewed as threats just by existing, in the wrong place, in the wrong skin, at the wrong time. She wrote their names on her board, each name a piece of memory no one had bothered to remember. But now they were evidence of a quiet classification system. She renamed this file, "The One Who Holds the Pawns," because in this game of chess no one watches the pawns, but the one who controls their movement controls the board. And Amara knew she had just found the one really pushing the pieces and guiding them precisely where they wanted, not to preserve order, but to clear the path for those deemed worthy to stay and quietly erase those the system decided should disappear. Every real revolution doesn't begin with gunfire. It starts with anonymous messages. Amara received the first message at 3 a.m. from an encrypted email address with an unfamiliar domain. "I was told to delete the file, but I only renamed it. If you look in the right place, you'll find the original in the backup. April_audit 2021. Password, ask the right question. Final line, I don't want to hide anymore. I just can't step out yet, but I'm here. Signed, J." That morning, Amara reopened an old drive pulled from the Charleston Police Department's IT room. Deep in the April_audit 2021 folder, disguised among routine maintenance reports, was a compressed file over 700 MB. She opened it. Hundreds of recordings, internal meetings, Zoom calls, Slack messages, many with chilling headers. Cleanup record 6/18. This week's watch list. No one gets caught on camera. If legal, asks, say it's about school safety oversight. Amara exhaled. Not relief, more like the breath of the last person breaking down a locked door, only to realize they weren't the only ones standing on the other side. Within 48 hours, 5 more emails arrived, all encrypted, all with one thing in common. They came from young civil servants, each in the system for 1 to 3 years. Each had once been instructed to adjust data or handle administrative irregularities, and now none of them wanted to be quiet anymore. One, signing as M, sent a clipped recording from last year's Community Security Coordination Board meeting. "We don't call it soft exclusion. We just don't let those kids feel comfortable enough to stay. If they leave on their own, we don't need enforcement. We just need silence." The voice on the recording? The city's Deputy Director of Internal Security, the same man once honored for improving youth-police relations. But the truth didn't only come from inside government. Strange messages began to appear online and Twitter. "You're not alone. The data's still there." On Reddit, check level 2 logs on CityNet. "The surveillance shell is still active." On a private Discord server, a file upload labeled "passing it to someone who'll guard it right," the hackers. Often called illegal, but in a world full of deletion scripts and buried truths, they were the ones preserving the digital memory of a city. They didn't want recognition. They just needed to know someone was finally hitting the right target. An independent lawyer, Elise Choi, formerly part of an international watchdog group protecting land seizure victims called Amara. Her first words, "I don't know if you'll trust me, but I want back in." From the inside, she had once been hired as legal counsel for the South Park redevelopment project, the same site where countless unlawful evictions and arrests began. When she requested independent oversight, her contract was terminated within 72 hours. Now she returned carrying never-released policy drafts, including clauses allowing flexible oversight teams to access school surveillance without parental notification. "Do you think the public would accept this if they knew?" Elise asked. Amara paused. No, but they were never asked. She compiled everything into a secure platform, the Silent Grid, a network of those who no longer stay silent. Beneath each leaked audio file, image, chat transcript was an abbreviated name, not full, but enough to say somewhere in this city, someone had chosen to stop hiding. and was tearing the net from the inside. She didn't call them whistleblowers, she called them keepers, those holding the light while everyone else still feared the dark. In the end, she wrote a public message to the entire city. No one destroyed this system, they just unplugged the machine they once thought was untouchable. And every one of them, lawyer, clerk, hacker, teacher, student, cut one wire. When the machine stops spinning, we'll see it for what it really is, and more importantly, we'll know who kept it spinning for so long. Charleston used to be the city where files were quietly closed. Now, those who once held the folders are opening them themselves. There's something Amara learned early on after months of flipping through case files. Injustice doesn't always live in what's been erased, it often hides in what's written too perfectly. She once believed the marks of wrongdoing would show through blood, violence, or vague reports. But no, the real signs were in the spotless pages, flawless incident logs, indictments any seasoned attorney could feel were missing something, yet couldn't quite say what. Using a consolidated data drive supplied by internal contacts, Amara began analyzing over 20 cases labeled internally resolved in the last 6 years. All were closed, no indictments, no convictions, and most crucially, no one remembered them. But when she laid the files side by side, a strange pattern emerged. Every case began with an unusual patrol. Charges listed were vague: low-level disorder, suspected uncooperative behavior, or worse, just difficult conduct, public defender's notes, absent at time of statement, camera status, recording device malfunction, under repair, not one. Over 80% used that exact phrase. That wasn't coincidence. Amara didn't need more evidence to know what she was seeing. This wasn't documentation. It was language, the administrative dialect of synthetic cleanliness. She recalled what a whistleblower once wrote to her: "Sometimes people don't write to report the truth, they write to create a different one." That line echoed in her head as she read the arrest log of a 16-year-old boy accused of suspicious behavior near a school. No photo, no witness, but the report ran 4 pages long, written like a thesis, polished, procedural, but completely eventless. She called Elise Choi, a legal analyst who had previously helped dismantle coercive land seizure policies, and asked, "Have you ever seen the system clean something by overwriting it with too much?" Elise gave only one reply: "The blurrier the law, the longer the file." Amara decided to try something different. She handed copies of the files to a group of law students at a nearby university. The assignment: analyze these as an independent case review, find the similarities without knowing they're all from the same system. The results made her skin crawl. 14 students noted the suspicious absence of legal counsel during critical moments. 11 observed that the language in the report sounded like it was written by the same person or modeled off a template. And one student, Camille, attached a separate file, an internal use-only incident template titled Template 3, Nonviolent Incident Handling, Sensitive Special Population. Amara printed that template, laid it beside 6 closed case files. Every punctuation mark matched. She didn't know who created the template. There was no signature. No one listed as responsible, but its existence alone proved one thing: the system's cleanliness was a manufactured product. Amara stood before her whiteboard, pinned with photos, diagrams, and clipped text. In the center, she wrote, "We're not just up against misconduct. We're facing a language built to hide misconduct, without needing to erase the evidence." That's what enraged her most. Not that someone lied, but that people had been trained to write correctly in a way that made what mattered disappear. She decided to do something unprecedented. Instead of releasing the files one by one, she announced a documentary-style public reading titled False Ink, a history written in white paper. Each case would be read aloud, not by lawyers, not by journalists, but by those directly affected, victims, families, or those once labeled non-compliant. Each person would read a segment. Each segment would be one case. No edits, no interpretation, just read it, as written, and let the audience feel what was wrong. The premiere drew more than 300 people, and when a 13-year-old boy read the final line of his case report, no threatening behavior was observed, however arrest was necessary to prevent potential escalation of disorder, the entire room fell into a silence no one could interrupt. It wasn't because there was nothing to say. It was because, for the first time, everyone understood justice doesn't always die from a bullet. Sometimes it dies from a misplaced comma. The day Amara Jefferson filed her lawsuit with the federal court of the Southern District, Charleston lay under a cold gray sky, as if the city itself was holding its breath. Not because of winter, but because, for the first time, an entire police department was being exposed not as a few bad actors, but as a complicit institution. The complaint spanned 147 pages, with 327 attached exhibits, including files of 27 victims previously handled internally, evidence of a privately funded shadow patrol network, duplicated reports written from templates, illegally obtained surveillance data, internal transcripts hinting at misconduct directives from higher-ups. The final section of the filing didn't use typical legal language. It was a quote from a 14-year-old boy held for 11 hours for wearing a suspicious colored hoodie. I didn't think anyone would believe me, because back then, I hadn't even learned how to name what injustice is. On the trial's opening day, the hallway outside courtroom 7 was lined with people by 5 a.m. They didn't bring protest signs. They brought photocopies of their children's records, scribbled dates of wrongful detentions, drawings of kids too scared to wear their uniforms to school. One father carried his 8-year-old son on his shoulders. The boy held a cardboard sign, "I just want to be believed when I say I'm doing my best." Amara didn't show up with a loud legal team. She sat quietly next to Elise Choi and 2 legal advisors, all people once sidelined by the system for being too uncooperative. That day, they wore plain white shirts, no ties, no name tags, making it clear they weren't there to represent power. They were there to speak for those who hadn't been heard. Mara's lead prosecutor began not with accusations, but with a question. If a system fails once, it's a mistake. If it fails 5 times, it's a breakdown. But if it fails consistently for over a decade, is that still a mistake? Or is it design? The courtroom held its breath. The police department's attorney fired back immediately. There is no evidence of any formal policy targeting minorities. We cannot blame the system when each case was processed legally. We request dismissal on grounds of insufficient institutional violation. Amara stood up. No mic, no notes. She simply said, "We don't need a written policy to prove one exists. We have repetition, we have consistent language, and most importantly, we have 27 people erased from records, but still here to speak." One of the first witnesses was Malik Rowe, wearing a pale blue shirt, visibly tense. But as he stood at the witness stand, he looked straight at the judge and said, "I wasn't threatened. I was made to believe that deleting records was a way of protecting the system. But over the years, I realized the system doesn't need protection from the truth. It needs protection from the people so scared of the truth, they distort it." Malik's testimony led to a critical trail of evidence, internal documents showing the use of a shared report template, stored in the system under the tag Template 3, non-violent but flag. An IT specialist confirmed it had been used at least 86 times over 5 years, mostly in arrests of black high school students. On another day, the 7th witness, Tasha Bell, Micah's mother, stood without reading notes and recounted her first visit to the police station looking for her son, only to be told by security, "There's no one named Micah Bell in the system. Maybe your grandson's already gone home." Then she looked straight at the jury and said, "I believed them because they had computers. I only had a heart. But now I know their computers are better at deleting names than finding people." Across the courtroom, defense witnesses for the department began faltering. One mid-level officer, questioned about why cameras malfunctioned during 4 separate incidents, paused for 16 seconds, then muttered, "I was told it was a system glitch." Amara asked, "Did you ever wonder if the system always glitches right when it could prove someone innocent, then maybe the glitch isn't the system's. On the 12th day of trial, Amara was granted permission to deliver a personal closing statement as the plaintiff. She brought no files, just a blank whiteboard. On it, she wrote, "If justice only exists when proven by video, who protects those erased from the frame?" She turned to the jury. "We are not asking you to punish everyone. We are asking you to name accurately what has happened here for years. A system not broken by accident, but because it was allowed to be. A system that didn't just erase people from paperwork, it erased them from memory. And now that the truth has been rewritten, we ask you not to let it be erased again." No applause followed, but after she finished, the judge paused for nearly a full minute before announcing the trial would extend one more week to review additional evidence. And in that pause, Amara knew this trial wasn't just about judgment. It was about decoding. Decoding how a system had operated invisibly. Decoding language used to hide the truth. Decoding wounds once called order. Because justice, when it can't speak its name, is just another form of silence. No one expected the next blow to come from the state prosecutor. Just days after a landmark trial began shaking Charleston's public institutions, Amara Jefferson, the woman who had submitted 147 pages of evidence to federal court, the one who made an entire city listen again to the voices of its own citizens, suddenly became the defendant in a new lawsuit. Charges: abuse of power to access confidential data, inciting organized resistance, and using her elected position to manipulate the media. In other words, you've done too much. Amara read the indictment alone in her office. No slamming papers, no outrage, just the flicker of a smile, so faint it could go unnoticed, but enough for those closest to her to know she saw this coming. Elise Choi, her independent attorney, skimmed the document and closed it calmly. "This isn't prosecution," Elise said. "It's a warning, not to punish, to stall, to intimidate, to turn Amara from a leader into a suspect." The media rippled like a cracked mirror. Headlines flipped within hours. Amara Jefferson, from justice icon to controversial figure. Chain reaction or justice manipulation. Transparency needed. Who's leading the movement and why? They didn't need to prove she was wrong. They just had to plant the question. If she's right, then why is she being investigated? The truth wasn't denied. It was blurred. Amara understood. This was no longer a battle of documents. This was a battle for conviction. Not legal, but mental. Not about evidence, but about public trust. She wasn't being accused because she'd broken the law. She was being tried because she'd stepped outside the role society assigned her. A woman, a black woman, not supposed to speak too loud. She didn't hold a press conference, didn't appear on talk shows. She chose something else, a public hearing, not to defend herself, but to ask, why must doing the right thing demand a purity test louder than the wrongdoers ever face? The hearing was held at Charleston Law School's main hall, not summoned by the state, no hierarchy, no obligation. And yet within 72 hours, over 400 people registered to attend. Amara stepped on stage. No podium, no clip-on mic, just her, holding up a printed copy of the indictment. Her voice low but clear. "This isn't evidence that I'm wrong. It's evidence that when a system can't silence the message, it tries to silence the messenger." She didn't defend herself. She told the story, how each witness found her, how each data set was delivered anonymously, how every page of every file had been rewritten by the hands of the people the system tried to erase. Then she read the names, not as accomplices, but as allies in purpose. Each one appeared in person, not to speak about her, but to speak about the moment they chose to believe in what's right, even when the person under scrutiny was the first person to offer them hope after years of silence. Troy Bennett spoke. "If someone is being investigated for helping me tell the truth, then that person isn't the problem. They're the reason I'm still standing." Kendra Moss said plainly, "She didn't use her power to save me. She used her belief so I could save myself." The hearing ended in silence, not from fear, but the kind of silence that settles when a city realizes Some prosecutions aren't about truth. They're about suppressing belief. Amara didn't withdraw her federal filing, didn't back off the investigation campaign. She moved forward, not needing to be believed as perfect, just needing to be believed as real. And as dusk fell, a clip from the hearing spread fast on social media. In it, Amara said, "They didn't hit me with weapons. They hit me with doubt. But I won't doubt myself, just because I've seen what they want to hide. Justice isn't something someone grants me. Justice is what I reclaimed. One testimony, one page, one voice that refused to stay quiet." And that was the one thing the system never expected, that when people no longer fear accusations, but fear the truth being left unsaid, every indictment becomes just ink spilled across a current that's already broken free of the page. Amara didn't choose a national network. She didn't pick a famous talk show. She didn't grant an exclusive interview. She chose a YouTube link, a webcam, a room with no studio lights, just a desk lamp, a whiteboard, and stacks of case files. And at exactly 8:00 p.m. Charleston time, the live stream began. No opening music, no branded logo, just Amara's face on screen, hair tied back, eyes steady. "No, make this isn't a show," she said. "This is what I've spent the last 3 years being taught never to say out loud." For the first 15 minutes, Amara said nothing about herself. No hearings, no prosecutions, no personal narrative. She just said their names: Troy, Kendra, Micah, Isaiah, Jamira. One slide per name, no photos, just basic information and partial files the system once called complete. Each file was opened live, displayed on screen. No effects, no narration. Amara read them in her own voice. The vague language in the indictments, the data error, camera logs, the sections marked "not eligible for further complaint," and finally, the lines labeled "internal handling - not for public release." After each page, she made no comment. She just looked into the camera, because the truth doesn't always need explaining. It just needs to be seen. After 30 minutes, viewership passed 100,000. In the live chat, people began to say what no one had asked them to. "My son was labeled suspicious because he wore a hoodie. I'm a teacher. I remember the day a student was taken right after class. I was one of the ones who deleted records. I'm sorry." No calls to action, no rants. Just unfiltered exposure, and with it the quiet unraveling of fear. Amara continued, playing the leaked audio clips. She opened one file. A man's low voice spoke. "If this gets out, the South Park redevelopment project is dead. Then don't let it get out. Log it internally. Handle it at the coordination level. Keep everything looking clean. And that girl, make sure she doesn't talk to the press." The recording ended. Amara looked at the camera, said nothing. She didn't need to. The viewers were speaking for her. At minute 50, she moved into the final section, a string of templated reports. She placed template 3 beside the actual reports, from 7 different cases, displayed sentence by sentence, description by description. The audience saw it clearly. Same structure, same phrases, same format. But 7 different people, 7 different lives. A law student typed in the chat, "This isn't a report, it's a script." Another replied, "And we were the blindfolded audience." At minute 59, Amara made her only direct counterattack. They call this live stream an emotional manipulation campaign. But if the emotions of someone assaulted, of a child wrongfully detained, or of a mother forced to believe her child is the problem, if those emotions are what we're told to be suspicious of, then maybe we shouldn't question the storyteller. Maybe we should question the system that made pain feel unspeakable. At minute 62, the stream cut out for 3 seconds. Black screen. Viewers thought it had been blocked, but when the feed resumed, the chat exploded. Someone typed, "If they're cutting it, it means she's hitting the truth." Another followed, "Not afraid anymore. We're recording it." At minute 75, Amara ended the live stream the simplest way possible. She shut off the screen share, stood up, turned her back to the lens, and taped a note to the whiteboard behind her. This time, the truth wasn't written by the most powerful. It was written by the ones They tried to erase. Then the screen went dark. No outro, no music, just an ending and a beginning. The next day, the entire live stream was split into 27 clips, each tied to the name of a victim, a witness, a voice once ignored. Hundreds of personal accounts reposted them. No one asked, no one was paid. People just did it. A hashtag began spreading. Let the tape run. Amara didn't hold a press conference after the live stream. He didn't need to. For the first time, the truth had found its way to the public. No editing, no gatekeepers, and no one's permission needed to be told. There was no explosion, no breaking news alert, no one dragged out in handcuffs. The collapse, just like it always happens in places used to power, arrived with the sound of people going quiet. The first to step down was the Assistant Director of Internal Security, the one who'd signed off on 14 soft surveillance contracts for the unofficial patrol unit. She resigned by email at 5:14 a.m., before the courthouse even opened. No explanation, no press conference, just one line to her team. Some things were once considered acceptable, but if I carry them one more day, I'll take them to the grave. 2 days later, another visitor arrived at the office of the independent legal team assisting Amara. A thin, modestly dressed man, former data analyst assistant in the city's finance department, the office that handled transfers to community security enhancement projects. He didn't ask for anonymity. He only asked for one thing: witness protection. I used to think I was just doing paperwork. I wasn't part of the arrests. But when I saw a kid who was just reading end up on a watch list, I knew. I helped write that list. He submitted the original funding authorizations, handwritten notes, and unsent email drafts, including one he never found the courage to send. We may not call them targets, but if every single one of them is a black child, what exactly are we targeting? Amara didn't rush to the media. She let the lawyers work directly with the courts. But the files kept coming. Like floodwaters cracking through a dam, a deputy planning director resigned. A crisis communications advisor requested to withdraw all previously authored response content. An IT admin, the one who created the admin G3 account for Granger's office, confessed, "I didn't ask what it was for. I just did it because I was told to." And the most frightening part wasn't who left, it was who stayed and stopped defending each other. This time, the media didn't need tips. They followed the resignations, reopened budget records, tracked funding reallocated from education to community watch initiatives. A local newspaper ran the headline, "You don't need orders to build a system, you just need enough compromise." Around the same time, the Department of Justice released its preliminary investigation report, evidence of administrative data manipulation, opaque internal processes, and systemic neglect of legal reporting obligations. Ongoing from 2014 to 2023 in Charleston. No single individual identified as director, because the system functioned as though no one was truly in charge. A new phrase took hold in the media: the system without a name. A structure where no one claimed responsibility, but no one was naive enough to believe no one benefited. Amara didn't celebrate. She knew. Phantoms don't vanish with statements. They scatter, shift form, wait for the next generation to forget. So she did what came next. She convened survivors, families, community lawyers, law students, data analysts, and teachers who'd watched their students be quietly flagged. Together, they drafted a declaration, the Charleston Pledge for Transparent Justice. It called for a total ban on surveillance programs not subject to civilian oversight, all internal disciplinary actions to be reported to an independent citizens board, no student behavioral data to be shared with law enforcement unless with guardian consent and clear legal basis. All special admin accounts in public systems to have traceable origin and access logs. The document wasn't signed by Amara. It was signed by all 27 individuals from the original erased list. They were no longer victims. They were now authors of law. When the court convened a follow-up hearing, a judge asked Amara, "After all this, do you believe justice has been served?" She didn't respond right away. Then she said, "I don't believe justice lives in verdicts. Justice happens when people who once had to live like ghosts finally stand in the light under their real names." That night, a video went viral. Amara standing outside the courthouse, looking toward the press. No speech, no microphone, just a woman walking up to her, taking her hand. Then another and another. Within a minute, all 27 people, once listed in internal case files, stood in a line. No fists raised, no signs, just standing. In broad daylight, with their faces visible and their eyes steady. Phantoms never vanish all at once, but once people stop fearing the dark, the shadows have nowhere left to hide. No sirens, no shouting crowds, no one chanting slogans. But across every street, every school, every clinic, every churchyard, a quiet wave began to spread. People no longer bowed their heads when questioned without cause. They didn't yell. They cited the law, quoted statutes, pulled out phones, recorded, filed complaints, not because anyone trained them, but because they had taught themselves how not to be silenced again. A 16-year-old girl in Georgia successfully filed a complaint after being suspended for wearing a T-shirt with a justice message. A group of parents in Louisiana sued the school board for lack of transparency and budget allocation. A mother in Missouri hand-wrote a 3-page letter citing state policy to demand access to full surveillance footage of her son's arrest. No headlines mentioned Amara Jefferson. They just called it the silent wave. And Amara, she didn't run for office, didn't become the face of any organization, didn't release a memoir, didn't sign a publishing deal. Instead, she reclaimed an old, defunded library on Charleston's west side, took down the signs, hand-painted the walls, built shelves from reclaimed wood. She called it simply Jefferson Community Law Room. No digital displays, no swivel chairs. Just blank paper, thumbtacks, old wooden chairs repainted by hand, and a slightly crooked whiteboard hung with a missing screw. The first class had only 8 people. Freshmen, a high school girl, a wrongfully arrested worker, a teenager who didn't know he had the right to remain silent during questioning. Amara didn't start with a curriculum. She asked one question. The last time you were told to be quiet, what did you do? Some didn't answer, but no one left early. And the next day they returned, with friends. Within 2 months, the class was full 3 nights a week. People didn't come for grades, not for certificates. They came to understand what they should have known all along, if the system had ever truly cared about their rights. People called Amara a teacher. She shook her head. I don't teach how to win. I teach how not to be fooled into thinking silence equals safety. One day, a journalist asked to interview her. He asked if she felt recognized after everything. She smiled. If someone needs me to be famous before they believe what I say, they probably never really listened to it. The journalist pushed. But if you could go back, would you choose a quieter path? Amara looked out the window, where a group of high schoolers was taping a poster listing rights during interrogation on a school wall. Then she answered, I don't need recognition, I just need more seats for young people to sit with me. And they did, one by one. No one looked the same, no one came from the same background. But they all shared one thing. They had been taught that silence was the price of peace. Now, they chose to learn the law to live in truth. A boy once beaten for holding his phone during a stop learned how to draft petitions. A father once denied access to his son's file learned how to cite statutes to demand oversight. A group of law students started a free Saturday legal aid hotline. No one led, because everyone had learned not to stand behind anyone anymore. Amara didn't live like a victor. She lived like someone who understood the real nature of victory. It's not in ending the fight, but in making sure the fight can't repeat itself the same old way. She never said, "We're done." She just said, "We are no longer silent." And to a system built on silence, that's not something you fix with a report. A year after the landmark trial, someone visited the class and asked, "Do you think the system has changed?" Amara replied, "I don't know, but I know people have started changing how they live inside it, and sometimes, as she once said in class, change doesn't come from new laws, but from an old question asked again by a voice that no longer shakes. Why should I be silent if I've done nothing wrong? Lesson and social message. The story of Mara Jefferson is not just one woman's journey against injustice. It's a powerful reminder that we live in a world where prejudice can turn truth into suspicion, and silence can become an accomplice to wrongdoing. From a single courtroom hearing to an exposed web of manipulation, from names once erased from the system to voices now echoing in broad daylight, what Amara and the brave individuals beside her achieved wasn't just a legal victory, it was a victory of awareness. The clearest lesson this story leaves behind is this: don't be quick to judge those who are quiet, different, or don't fit the expectations of the crowd. Sometimes the people we hear from the least are carrying the truths we need the most. Talent, dignity, and human worth aren't found in job titles or clean records. They're found in the ability to rise after rejection, in the strength it takes to speak truth, knowing it might cost everything. And above all, justice always finds a way to win, not through perfection, but through persistence. Not in the flash of a verdict, but in the echo of questions no one can avoid anymore. So ask yourself, have you ever been misunderstood just because someone didn't take the time to know you? Have you ever been underestimated and quietly proved them wrong? If you've been there, or if you've seen someone stay silent out of fear they wouldn't be believed, speak up. It doesn't have to be loud, just clear and steadfast. Share this story with someone who needs to know they're not alone. Because once a voice is shared, it's no longer just a story, it's an act. If this story made you think, share it so others can learn too. And don't forget to subscribe for more powerful, real stories, not about heroes, but about humans.